Hello, Andrew here. Welcome to the first lecture on the Using Creative Multimedia for Youth Engagement module. In this lecture, I'm just going to do a rundown of what we can expect to cover within the next 10 lectures. And before getting into a more specific sort of a breakdown of, in this lecture, about how to do a critical discourse analysis, or more specifically, a multimodal approach to that, which is probably more relevant for a multimedia age, and an update on, like, the more traditional language and grammar features of more traditional critical discourse analysis. Within the next lecture, then we're going to look at a historical context of all this framed next to youth culture. So we look at, just the role that multimedia in particular, has played within youth culture, and use all that as a frame to kind of move forward with the 5 lectures thereafter, which we look at, case studies are picked from games, films, music, different forms of popular or alternative culture relating to feminist, race, queer development discourse, and how that has kind of evolved in terms of global media platforms in particular. So then we'll bring all that back to a young person-centered sort of look at multimedia, and how to apply critical discourse analysis to keep young people safe and informed in their use of social and digital media. And then we look at the internet and how social activism, or being social engagement, has been affected as a result of the ubiquity of multimedia. And then we'll look at the last 2 lectures. We're going to pick off specific things relating to your own work as a youth worker with young people. And we look at a critical analysis of digital content for youth work. So obviously that's a newer area, but there is still some sort of really good best practice examples, and, things that have fallen short in terms of what can and should be expected from youth work, in terms of a kind of a critical discourse around that. So all this should kind of arrive at the final lecture, where we'd expect to develop a multimedia policy for a youth organisation, and that being the kind of sum of all the efforts of this course, in one sense, to kind of combine it all into one place, so we know we've got something which is, well informed, highly critical of everything that's gone before it, and is looking to put in place different policies or different understandings around that within youth organisations and youth centres, which isn't essentially there, and something which does advocate and is kind of led by youth workers on behalf of young people. So that's what we're going to we'd expect to cover there with that. So with all that in mind, I'm going to kind of get into the contents of this lecture, which will be how to do critical discourse analysis. So within it, firstly, I just want to kind of, this loosely is going to cover critical discourse analysis, or a multimodal approach to that, which will be explained in the next in a slide now in a moment. And then, where this kind of does interlink with more traditional understandings of media studies and cultural studies in particular. So all of this will be just kind of, all we can really expect to do here is get a kind of a good snapshot of these sorts of areas of studies and the theoretical sort of base of them. And they will kind of come up in turn throughout the next lectures. So we can kind of take off different aspects of that and apply it to certain case studies, for example. So, just kind of to put a note on that, really. So just in terms of critical discourse analysis, as I said, traditionally it'd be more related to, language and grammar features to create meaning, and the persuasive elements of that, I suppose, that lead people to kind of, leads a thought process in young people, or not in young people, but in people in general, or viewers, or people who receive messages, essentially. So obviously language and grammar, although it would, relates to the written word and, say, editorial or newsprint, or kind of broadcast media or spoken word, it doesn't really stretch far enough to go into more associative things that would, would come around with multimedia or the interrelationship between a lot of those. So this is the reason where we want to kind of update this to a multimodal approach to that first. So where a number of modes of communication are kind of covered with that. And all we're really looking at here is like just a deconstruction of the elements that are combined to build up messages and the meaning behind them and the meaning within that. So after that, we'll just kind of, that's as far as we really need to really think on that right now. I'm just going to show a video of Gunter Kress talking about a multimodal approach and how different modes of communication need to be considered with in the current age of multimedia and ubiquitous sort of messaging services and devices.
So what happens when we put modes together?
Well, behind it all is, of course, the notion of communication. I want to communicate something to you. I have a meaning which I want you to get in some way. I have the sense that one mode alone won't do it. So I put modes together because I have a sense that this mode will allow me to do this kind of thing best, and this mode will allow me to do this other thing best. So, for instance, on this website that we have here, I can click on a particular thing, and what I have is something which is in time. There's a mode of moving image or little video, which is moving image and its speech together. These things are in time. But at the same time, I have things which are not in time, bits of writing. So I have things which are not in time and things which are temporally instantiated. I have an image, a still image, which is spatial. So because I want to say things which are about things which are in time, they move, things which are not in time, they're stationary, things which are spatially kind of displayed like images, I want to put all these together because of the meaning that I want to make. So I have a sense of what these things do. I have a sense of what I want to mean. And so I have a kind of an interest to make a composition in which certain kinds of things come together in a particular way that best exemplifies or communicates what I want to mean.
Okay.
So these modes are kind of arranged according to the interest I have as the person communicates, but also my sense of who you are and what might be most interesting, most readily memorable, what most pleasurable, most informative for you. So these things are sort of set in a communicational frame.
So you seem to suggest that different modes can do different kinds of things.
Yes, and I suggested in part that it's me who makes the decision about which mode to use. There is also, of course, around me a sort of conventional notion. So, for instance, if I'm kind of communicating something very formally, then writing might seem to be, because my society tells me, the best means for doing that. It seems that we have in our society not just these modes available to use, but also conventions that indicate to us, not as strict rules, nobody's going to get shot, but as rules, conventions, to use them in particular ways. And so we might say that writing over many hundreds of years in literate societies has become specialized to be the carrier of certain kinds of information. There's a functional specialization of writing. And also, of course, then what happens is that writing in that past, which is now changing very rapidly, carried most of the informational load. So we can ask, in particular on this website, which mode is carrying most informational load.
So if we look at this BBC News website, we can talk about which of the different modes has the most functional specialization and functional load?
Which we can say which mode has been specialized for what kinds of purposes.
Okay.
Yeah, so the writing next to the image seems to be specialized to kind of make certain kinds of things in the image seem more salient, or to give a context, a frame for what this image actually is. That seems to be what writing is doing here. That's its specialization. Now the question is, which of them carries more informational load? And I would find that actually quite difficult to answer, because writing kind of frames, it provides an environment, it provides a kind of a background to the image, but the image seems most potent. And then they're also organized in a kind of a left-right relationship. Yeah? The image is on the left and the writing is on the right. So I'm asking myself, does that matter? And would it matter if the writing was on the left and the image on the right? Now, these are the kinds of questions we now have to begin to think about, because we're making a composition in which everything that is there ought to be where it should be, in terms of the meanings I want to make.
So is this what we mean by layout then?
In relation to the module we're just looking at, we're looking at a module here of image and writing. On the website, it's quite near the top, and it's on the, if this was sort of seen as two columns, really, it's in the left column. That has a particular place there. Seemingly, if you kind of look at the website, you might come to that first, especially if you scroll down. You don't have to scroll down in order to see that. So something about the space has been used to make that most prominent. It's what you come to first after you've got the BBC band at the top. It's first, it's on the left. In the West, we're trained to read from the left to the right, so we look there first. It's most prominent. Layout, the possibility of putting things in space in a meaningful way, has been used to make us attend to that before we attend to other kinds of things. We don't have to scroll down. It's kind of prominently there. That's what we mean by layout.
Is this related to if we talk about ordering?
Absolutely. For instance, on this website, as you can see, there's a smaller module opposite in the right column, where this particular module about the soldiers and the tank and the war in Afghanistan are. A smaller kind of thing. And somehow, if you now imagined this smaller element being on the left, and the module about the war in Afghanistan being on the right, intuitively you might think it would look unbalanced. It would seem kind of odd. It wouldn't seem quite right. So there is a kind of thing about ordering which might be both about significance. It might be about a sort of a sense of a proper composition in which things should be kind of balanced in terms of a visual kind of ordering of them. And yes, that's what ordering is about, but also the fact that as you scroll down, other things appear. Somebody has thought things which are less in importance can be lower in terms of scrolling down on the website. So
the things which you mentioned earlier, the word salient. So what they have assumed being more salient will be, for example, on the left top side.
I would say so, yeah. So in the module, the tank is on the left, the writing is on the right. In these two columns, the item on the war in Afghanistan is on the left, and the other item, which I can't quite see what it's about, it's trailing something in some other bit of program, is on the right-hand side. So there is a kind of a sense of which are the more significant spaces on that screen.
In linguistics, we're used to talking about coherence and cohesion in a text. How can we use those terms when we're talking about multimodality?
The way that, in my own understanding of linguistics, that's been used is that cohesion tells you about the devices you use for making something coherent. And I think you can use that much in the same way here. You get a sense, for instance, if this screen was arranged in such a way that you say, sometimes what seems to be most important is on the right, sometimes what's most important is on the left, that would produce a sense of lack of coherence. The cohesive device of ordering in space would have been not really fully used. But also, if, for instance, you had a color scheme here, where the kind of, I don't know what you call the BBC red there, a Moroni sort of red.
Banner.
In that banner. If that color, it could be matched by other kinds of reds, or pinks, or greens, or blues. So then the sense of coherence of the page would be destroyed by a kind of an inconsiderate use of the the mode of color. Yeah, so there are devices here that produce the sense of, yes, this belongs here. It is where it ought to be. And this is where it ought to be. And they are of various kinds. It's positioning. It's there is something coherent about the color that occurs here. The color in the image of the tank isn't out of place in relation to the maroon of the banner of the yeah. So I think one can transfer the notion of cohesive devices. What are the means of making something coherent? And the notion of it is coherent, it makes sense, from the linguistic or from other things to this. But we would have to sort of say it's no longer about sentences in sequence or elements of sentences which kind of link across from sentence to sentence. But it's different kinds of things. For instance, in linguistics, nobody would think about color as being a means for making something coherent.
Okay, so within that, it's kind of, there's an interesting breakdown of a lot of things that we're going to discuss throughout this lecture. And just to pick up on a few of them, one would be the kind of, everything being broken apart and deconstructed. What I find, as you might find it jarring, I deliberately kind of thought to include it, was they're referencing a website that you never see. And as frustrating as that might have been for you to watch to see a reference, you could relate it to, having looked at news websites yourself. But also it does give that first sort of introduction to how information can be abstracted and, can be perceived in a certain way. So to look at things differently and the meaning and significance under them is, just to flag that, because I know it's a little bit jarring, but there was a bit of a reason for that, really. Just to kind of go back at the start of what Chris was saying there about a certain sort of grammar that historically has kind of grown up around how communication and meaning has happened through the written word being, something highly regarded and something sought, really, or, delivered as like a social norm. And everything kind of coming thereafter. And, the other elements of it would be a photo having a spatial element and just including a different sort of a different sense when you were confronted with an image like that, and all of this to take place temporally, I suppose, through time, through like with video components and other elements that are kind of through time and aren't fixed within time. So it's this sort of combination of what would be traditionally, a print artifact, say like a newspaper, with words printed on a page next to images, and the associative qualities and the communication and the meaning that was put into that series of decisions of how the editorial would have happened on that. These are things that you'd be familiar with from the previous module when it came to designing your own posters, or likewise editing your own video or audio as well, where it's a series of decisions that are made to deliver that. And that essentially is like a design element, what would have been discussed there in terms of layering information, separating it, ordering it, the layout of it. So one part of that is just the practical, the design component of that, of how this can be most effectively conveyed to a viewer. How can it be legible and made clear to an eye, to an ear, through a brain? How can the message be kind of delivered? But on the other side of that is just this understanding that all of this is made up of a series of decisions, and that essentially is trying to impart a communication and a meaning. And it's this meaning which is the subjective aspect of that we want to kind of get at. So in terms of like an underpinning of, if we're looking at critical discourse analysis, media studies, or cultural studies, a key term we could look at would be semiotics, which would be, to put it shortly and put it bluntly, the meaning of meaning, that we want to deconstruct that. So, you could get into any number of sort of means of parsing a discussion of this, but essentially the meaning of meaning, both visual semiotics and, just more traditional, grammar or linguistic semiotics in terms of the meaning of how things are conveyed. So this is kind of, again, I just want to kind of start breaking this up to just look at a more deconstructed, a way of breaking all this information apart, really, before we start to kind of put it back together. And the ideal for me is that I think this, mostly it's just very interesting, and it's good to have the critical thinking to just see that something just doesn't arrive in front of you complete and finished, but there is any number of decisions behind that. And they should be certainly understood, or at least appreciated that that is the case. So nothing can be taken as its whole and therefore just mindlessly consumed as like a norm or as a truth without any sort of critical model underpinning it, you know? So, to kind of frame that once more in relation to a kind of more of a media studies, or like, you know, a more traditional sort of reading of this, we're going to look at a video on Roland Barthes, and this is just relation to you know, the concept of signs and signifiers within messages, and the sort of a visual grammar in particular with that.
Switch on the TV. What do you see? The breaking news graphic, the scrolling text, the news presenter behind the desk. Read the signs, the hair, the makeup, the suit. What is this story about? The rhythm of the words, numbers, colors. Why are these codes here? The music, the size of the letters. How do you feel? A news bulletin is a selection of signs. The flow of words, read off the autocue. The artifice of the presenter's cadence. The news voice. The gaze looking right at you, but through a lens. Visual stand-ins for credibility, authority, legitimacy. Rhetorical motifs constructing the biggest myth of all, that what we are watching is unmediated reality. This is what Roland Barthes would have seen. The TV screen as a cultural text, and he would have unveiled its myths. Because to read symbols and signs, to interpret them, is the work of a semiotician. In the 1950s, Barthes started writing about popular culture. In his book Mythologies, he gathered multiple discordant subjects: food, horoscopes, religion, advertising, toys, photography, detergents. He saw these as elements of mass culture, imbued with ideology, providing society with the myths that once came from fables and epics. Barthes said, the starting point of these reflections was usually a feeling of impatience at the sight of the naturalness with which newspapers, art, and common sense constantly dress up a reality which is undoubtedly determined by history. Barthes didn't just spotlight the myths that surround us. He put back the curtain on their ideological premises. He warned us against taking all that surrounds us at face value. The fonts in your daily newspaper, they don't just reflect meaning, they add it, they change it. The framing of this shot, what's the history behind it? The selfie, the latest representation of the bourgeois individual. The stick, a seal of authenticity, of status. The subtitle, the voice as text. What could be more Barthesian?
Okay, so that's kind of a really interesting short sort of breakdown and very effectively put together idea, just to kind of deconstruct a lot of these signs and how they kind of come about, and you know, things that are just kind of presented as fact and truth through time and have to be sort of received as such. And there's, you know, once we start deconstructing it, it gets really interesting, where you see the historical elements of this, or the different sorts of cultural elements that are being enforced or reinforced throughout that. To take up on one instance of the gaze there, where we look at the in the lecture on you know, feminism, we will look at, you know, the concept of the male gaze and women being objectified through that, and that being like presented now looking like it's being kind of destroyed and taking apart day by day by any number of really interesting feminist movements that are kind of emerging, or have always been there, but are now kind of finally kind of, you know, it is coming to pass, which we'll get at all that, where it's very interesting just to see how how historically that has been an accepted thing, and it also looks it's presented as such. Likewise with status and different norms, it'd be, you know, things relating back to you know, how portraiture would have done it, been made, how sculpture would have been made, how what that would have depicted, and who it would have depicted in what possible light. So once we get looking at this, we see that it is all the mediated reality of these things, and how they are kind of put across is really interesting to kind of lift the bonnet and look underneath that at the engine to see how all that's been put together. And instantly just delivers a kind of a critical thinking model to that. So with that in mind, I just want to, we'll get into some firm examples of this now in a minute, but the last sort of element of that, I suppose, one, you know, because we're looking at the devices and the sort of the presentation of images and messages, or the broadcasting or the imparting of a communication like that. The other vital element of this is how it is received. So we're going to look at this through, you know, cultures of representation, and then also about the identity, I suppose. And when we get to that point, we'll bring it right back towards, like, you know, a youth culture and young people looking at this and how identity is formed through that, which is the most interesting element for our concerns right now. But before we go near that, we just want to look at that notion of identity and representation through, you know, a cultural studies frame. And again, like that, about how a lot of this would have been is said as like status or cultural norms, historically defined. And, you know, a lot of it instantly relates to, say, things like colonialism or post-colonialism or neo-colonialism, or any sort of a number of examples of, you know, patriarchal societies, or men, or mostly white men, white European men, and how they present themselves to the world as this sort of status and value system that is imbued and bought into, you know, without any sort of further consideration of these things, I suppose. So in terms of cultural studies, we look at this as a field that breaks apart the theoretical, the political aspects of that through a cultural analysis, and instantly then you can just see that the amount of political or power dynamics that go on within contemporary culture that are founded historically and have defining traits and conflicts with that. So there's any number of firm examples. Again, once we start looking at you know, issues around you know, race discourse, we will cover a lot of this within that discussion as well, in terms of the kind of cold hard facts of how you know, people who aren't white or aren't white male essentially are depicted through media historically, I suppose, and how this is kind of how that has changed and updated today. Before we get there, I'm just going to have another video with Stuart Hall talking about the concept of representation, really, and this will kind of take up how this is all received, I suppose, and the peculiarity that happens with the sort of just the receiving of this without any sort of critical sort of analysis of what you're receiving.
Just let me say what the main theme of what I'm going to say today is. I'm going to talk about the notion of representation, which is a very common concept in culture studies and in media studies kinds of work. But I want to explore the idea a little bit, and I want to try and say something about how I understand representation working, and why it's a more difficult and more complex subject than it appears to begin with. I'm talking about largely visual representation, or the examples I'm going to try to cite are from visual representation, but I think what I'm going to say has a bearing on the practices of representation in general. I choose visual representation because it's a kind of cliche to say that in the modern world, our culture is saturated by the image in a variety of different forms. So the image itself, whether moving or still, and whether transmitted by a variety of different media, seems to have become the privileged sign of late modern culture. And late modern culture is not only that culture which one finds in the advanced industrial, post-industrial societies of the Western world, but because of the global explosion in communication systems, it is also the saturating medium, the saturating idiom of communication worldwide. So I think to try and take the idea of representation to the image is an important question. And cultural studies has paid a tremendous amount of attention in one way or another to the centrality of representations and of the practice of representation. And media studies itself is, in an obvious sense, concerned in part with the variety of different texts, in my instance, visual texts, representations, which are transmitted by the media. But I'm going to stand back from that a bit to begin with and try and look at the process of representation itself. Now, the word has a kind of double meaning, even in its common sense, understanding. It does mean to present, to image, to depict, to offer a depiction of something else. And the word representation or representation does sort of carry with it the notion that something was there already and through the media has been represented. Nevertheless, this notion that somehow representation represents a meaning which is already there is a very common idea, and on the other hand, one of the ideas that I'm going to try to subvert. So I give you the common sense meaning to try to take it back a little bit in what I'm going to say. But then there's another understanding of the word representation, which also plays a role in what we bring to this topic, because we speak of political figures as representing us in some way. We don't probably say that very often these days because we may not think they represent us very well, but they're sort of supposed to represent us, and in that sense, they stand in for us. They are our representatives. Where we can't be, they can be. So the notion of something which images and depicts, and that which stands in for something else, both of those ideas are kind of brought together in the notion of representation. Now, what this idea that media practices, among other things, represent topics, represent types of people, represent events, represent situations. What we're talking about is the fact that in the notion of representation is the idea of giving meaning. So the representation is the way in which meaning is somehow given to the things which are depicted through the images or whatever it is on screens or the words on a page which stand for what we're talking about. And if you think that the meaning that it is giving is very different from or a kind of distortion of what it really means, then your work on representation would be in measuring that gap between what one might think of as the true meaning of an event or an object and how it is presented in the media. And there's a lot of very good work which is in media studies, which is exactly like this.
Okay, so again, just, taking all these just as snapshots and just kind of touching on a few sort of salient points of what these different studies and disciplines and forms, modes of analysis can kind of give us. Again, we'll be applying them and reapplying them, but to just get to the essence of it, what we're looking at there, if we look at representation or representing, already, again, we can just see the vital aspect of semiotics is to pick apart the meaning of the word and just to break it into its component parts, which is a representing. And this kind of points to underpinning all of these sort of areas is, the understanding of linguistics and language and how it works, and certain sort of grammar, both visual and sort of, lexical grammars that kind of go with it. And to get right back, if we look at it through a cultural studies sphere to the etymology of words and how the words have come around, or the inherited sort of, assumptions that go on. For example, with this course, I'm speaking to, students from Ireland, England, and Greece, yet I'm conducting it through English. And again, just things that are kind of accepted rather than sort of understood or have any sort of foreground or breaking apart of it. It just shows how, like, you know, quickly this becomes a really kind of rigid and cemented form of things and how meaning is kind of conveyed. And that's why it's really interesting to kind of get under the bonnet of this stuff consistently. But within this, between the, you know, the kind of the cultural studies or media studies view of these things, we can see how consent is manufactured, or, you know, different agendas can be set. Or if we look towards young people, then how, like, moral panics can happen about, like, you know, depictions, or how things can be regarded as normal when it comes to identity around, you know, modes of representation, be it heroes, villains, what is normal sexually, normalizing violence, what's normal gender-wise, power-wise, you know, what is inherited wisdom, or what's kind of valid and learned. And all of these things just kind of pointing to the same end, to just see that this is, it's things that are inherited and come to pass as facts. And, you know, therein lies a kind of an issue when it comes to critical analysis and thinking about them. So just to take this idea of, to bring it right back to youth, really, and this is where it gets really interesting, because in the mass mediated world in particular, it's probably never been more so that we have the spectre of young people's understanding of media, and how do you relate, as Andy Rillick says here, how do you understand themselves as citizens with rights and responsibilities being closely related? And the presence of even that debate, or an acknowledgement of that, does, you know, pose the question of how media underpins, you know, the young people's perception and the influence that they have in the nature of democracy or democratic representation, or how they perceive, you know, a democracy or rights or accepted rights or everything like this, you know. So just along those lines, it gets very, very interesting when it comes to that. So our job really is to start kind of breaking that down and to build forms of media literacy, to kind of give young people in particular the wherewithal to critically think and analyze and compare and break it down, and just look at the component parts and how they're put together, and never take it as just kind of an assumption or a fact because it's arrived in front of them. And the study of this being the most interesting thing, because you can learn so much about, you know, how media does structure ideas, and ideally structures democracies, or, you know, very progressive sort of democracies where everyone is included. And, you know, we actually use this multimedia and mass media devices as tools, rather than, you know, kind of social controlling models, I suppose, to kind of to go into that, you know. So, okay, so that just kind of gives you to break apart a number of the areas and kind of theories, I hope, of how it's thinking. But again, like I said, all this is going to be reinforced and reinformed, and different elements of it being reapplied throughout the next lectures. If there's any issues around any of that, please contact me in between. But I'm just going to go on now with sort of a few how-to or kind of hard examples of how you can apply critical discourse analysis, or a multimodal version of that as well. Okay, so we see here we're just looking in terms of the meaning of words, I suppose, and the kind of lexical semiotics about these two sentences essentially having the same information, but the impart of that information, or, you know, the different sort of the meaning and the subjective meaning has been changed by the changing of one word from said to whinged, where we get this sort of, the second one gives this sort of disparaging you know, opinion of Jane, and it makes it sound like she's always whinging, and just today she happens to be whinging about how her housemates simply do not do enough cleaning. In terms of the facts established, Jane did say that my housemates simply don't do enough cleaning. So instantly we can just see, you know, within that simple example, and a kind of an innocent example of that, how, you know, meaning and persuasion can be put on words in a really sort of simple yet sophisticated way, where it can be added to like that. So if we look at to another example of, you know, if it was related to something like a dispute or something, and the language that would come in, be it sort of a civil rights dispute or a workers' rights dispute or anything related to that, or any sort of form of, protest, and how that is framed and worded in broadcast media, through news media, through any sort of outlet that needs, a kind of a series of decisions that will, would lead to a mediated reality and a different representation of that. We can see how this can become quite sort of serious straight away and become, quite an issue. So if we look towards, visually how this can be put together in the space of a gaze, where we look at, when it comes to public figures and, how people are depicted, that this also has a massive amount of semiotic meaning, and a sort of a visual semiotic meaning, and a lot of connotations that can come across how someone is presented. So, say, for example, if we were to put one or two of these images in a different sort of context, it totally colours the context and how this person is perceived. Just so we know that the image on the right and versions of them were much easier to come by online than the version on the left, which looks like, something almost similar to what you'd expect for, like, a leader of a world leader of a country. But anyway, beside all that, that's we can see that the same figure can have a positive or a disparaging sort of impact on the gaze depending on the image chosen. And if we look again, if we get into the brass tacks of how broadcast media or newsprint media works, there's data banks and stocks of, stock libraries of images, all with, like, as a series of decisions and meaning, subjective decisions that are made and informed, and an element of design that is applied to all that, to how things are going to be presented. And we mustn't lose sight of this, just that these are decisions and choices, yet they become sort of presented as, as norms or a mediated reality as soon as they enter, our gaze in this instance. So, again, just to kind of look at all that. So while we're really looking at that, there's a lot of this is subjective, essentially. And it's subjective on both sides, I suppose. One is it's subjective for a viewer and how they receive a message or a mode or a signal or a meaning. And the other is from when these arrive. So, for example, we look at this image. We have an image, two portraits by the portrait photographer Arnold Newman, and the one on the right is kind of a more dignified portrait of the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and the one on the left is a kind of a famous portrait photo of Krupp's, who is head of the Krupp's manufacturing empire out of Germany. And there was all I wanted to do with this image is, like, it's a historical one of just how it was kind of framed in the kind of sinister element that came across by the arrangement of a person with a pose, with lights, and the subjective kind of use of a camera by the photographer in this means to just kind of, fully, present a person in a sinister light. And, this is Newman, who's Jewish, was drawing attention to the relationships of Krupp's relationship with, the Nazis at the time, and how this had kind of come to pass. And once he was aware of that fact, he sought to depict it different. But all I'm saying is it's the same elements of a person in a chair next to a background with light, yet the handling of this is totally different. And you better believe that, the one on the left was not too well received at the time. But it has become kind of a really, well-known image as a result of that, just about how subjective things can be, and how portraiture in particular can be used to make people and things appear in a certain light. If we move towards, like, print media and the layout and just associative, errors or fails, as we would call them now in sort of social media terms, of how things are kind of relayed next to each other. We have like, you know, something as the cover of the paper on the left of, you know, almost being comic, I suppose, and, you know, just that sort of associative thing between a headline and an image, and the associative nature of how the viewer would look at messages and the meaning in them and relate them and associate them together, can be kind of trivial on one side. And then we look at an image on the right where it could almost be like a liable issue, you know, where someone would probably have a rightful case to kind of take publication to task for presenting themselves in such a way next to a certain headline, and that becoming, you know, it's something with a discrediting factor, I suppose, with that. But again, just from our ends, we just want to look at that in terms of the gaze and the layout and the design of things, and how we perceive and relate things and associate them together. And these sort of abstracts in there having a kind of becoming quite physical very quickly, I suppose, that we can just see that there's a firm relationship between these elements. And again, just to kind of talk about the perception, I suppose, I just wanted to pick this one where I just, there's a caption to come up on the next one, but I'm just going to do this quietly for a minute so you can take it in, and then just look at this picture by Vincent van Gogh. So all I really wanted to point out with that was just how additional information can colour a sort of a context, where this was one of the last paintings that Van Gogh painted. And I suppose anyone who wasn't aware of that, I suppose, it was the difference between just looking at an image and having a certain sort of interaction with it, or, you know, a sort of certain appreciation of it, or whatever it would have gone on. But once it becomes kind of loaded with another different bit of information, just a kind of a set of facts around that, it kind of does unpack a whole other set of things, potentially, of, like, you know, the mental frame that the person who made the film or made the picture might have been in. It kind of gives something poignant to that as well, I suppose. And you know, how all I'm really trying to do here is just to associate how we attach meaning and stories to images in particular, or to visual content, or simply to words, or to the combination of those things, and about how that can become loaded, and all again lead towards like a perception of that, I suppose, and just to give that a little bit of weight with how that kind of comes across. So there was one other point that kind of I wanted to pick up on from earlier when we looked at the video of multimodality approach to things, where it was kind of, you know, in terms of a critical discourse analysis, we see a breakdown of, they were describing the BBC website and the cover of that, and if that was a printed paper, we would have the luxury of, like, you know, having this physical artifact in front of us, which has paper and images, which is printed, exists in your hands in space and time, can be left on a table, and you can kind of return to it whenever. But what is kind of notably different in this, when we start kind of looking towards a multimodal approach to discourse analysis and how things have changed in terms of a multimedia age, is how that physical artifact is no longer there. So you would look at the BBC website or a news broadcast website on a daily basis, or even on an hourly basis, or when, like, you know, breaking news emerges. So it's a constant shift and a flux there through time. And that being something which is has never been more so now. You know, the relationship we would have had before would be with TV or broadcast media, or, you know, fast edited music video, television, or, you know, a different sort of form of entertainment. Likewise with pop music, and how that would relate to, say, a radio, or the broadcast of these things, and it being a constant sort of flux and transient form of it, I suppose. So how you begin to attach a critical discourse analysis and a meaning to that is the key vital elements, you know. And we kind of get at this in relation to youth culture in particular, and young people, and say elements like advertising and how that would work, or entertainment, even simply that. of how like new forms and the new sort of way of doing things is always a vital component to be thrown in there, but it's constantly sort of changing and regurgitating and, you know, throwing up different versions of these elements. And it's this key issue of how do we get to a point where you can kind of pick out firm examples for a critical analysis and a kind of a conscious model of thought, or like, you know, not just accepting images at face value like that. So I have two quick videos to that end before I finish off. One related to video editing and how that works, and one related to like a more of an audio sphere. But I'm just going to show the video one, and then I'll come back quickly after that.
And this shape here is what I call the monoform, which is simply a name I give to the basic structure of what we see on television, and in a majority sense, most of what we see in the commercial cinema today. Because you don't just see a subject, you see something being communicated, so-called, to the audience via a particular system of communication. Of course, it's a series of rapidly editing pictures, constantly displacing us from one thing to another, from one subject, one visual image, with all its associated metaphorical, symbolic, personal meanings, different weight of information on the screen, different mass, different shape, different movement, and we're asked to deal with that, usually in 5, 6, or 7 seconds, which is the average cutting rate, and you change the next, and so on, so on, so on. Endless barrage of visual information, which is, of course, being accompanied by an audio barrage, all being thrust at the audience in a one-way monolinear push from beginning to end, where in fact, of course, what the audience is to feel or decide at the end point here is already determined at the beginning point on all sorts of levels.
Now, what we do in Discovery, which we're rather proud of, is we're ahead of the game in this because we've had to do it for so long. And you build in the customization right from the word go, almost the moment the pencil touches the paper pad. There are filmmakers who quite justifiably say, this is my work, and I want it to stay the way it is. That's their right, and we respect that. Those are the films we don't buy, and those are the films we don't transmit.
The whole purpose of 20th century mass audiovisual media is that it is not predicated on incorporating the ideas, feelings, experiences, subjectivity, memory, knowledge, wisdom of the audience, or the viewer, the viewers, and engulfing them and taking them into the process and sharing. And it's simply involved, indeed, it's in 20th century mass audiovisual media, is designed to withhold those, to push those away, and to instead engulf the people with this fabricated, fragmented, arbitrary process where the person's participation is held out. And that's why everything is moving very fast, to hold back any opportunity for the person to have time to come in and enter the material and challenge it or negotiate with it or anything.
Okay, so yeah, that's kind of apt in a number of ways, and it definitely just speaks to the it's never more so than with young people in particular with that, you know, that visual metaphor of using the shifting sands is kind of, again, quite apt with that. What we see is that there's this sort of media being used as a marketing device, or, you know, an advertising element, really. And, that's how most broadcast media pays for itself, is through advertising. A lot of young people don't even know that. It's the ads, it's the things between what they're watching in terms of the messages that is paying for that. And never more so as it being, as we discussed elsewhere, has been geared towards young people. So you have this creation of wants and needs with the absence of anything sort of substantial. So it's like a trivial ephemera that comes with that. And as Peter Watkins kind of said there, it all has to be agreed from the outset, as we've seen from our own, practicals in terms of video editing, where you do have to have an idea, and the amount of thought that goes into arranging material and edits and how subjective all that is, where you want to present it as sort of a clean, crisp thing to a viewer at the end. So it is front loaded in terms of how it's going to the outcome that can happen from that. So all of these things are very restrictive in the creative sense of the word, and restrictive in terms of, it arriving at as a barrage of images that don't need to be critically sort of dissected by any viewer whatsoever, And this kind of famous quote by Marshall McLuhan about, we don't know who discovered water, but we know it wasn't a fish, is kind of apt in terms of that, where we see that it's kind of, you're swimming around in this sort of mass mediated world where there's a swirl, and they say in terms of editing, you get 4 frames before the next edit. Anything under that is just, it's scientifically you can't make sense of it, But if we look at like 4 to 6 second edits, and you've just this constant flow of information like that, it's hard to comprehend it. It's a barrage, and it's hard to kind of sit down and deconstruct each one of those messages and see how it kind of comes about. So, this is kind of what we're faced with in terms of the a mass mediated approach to that. And when we combine that with, say, as I kind of wanted to point out earlier, how news is kind of disseminated, and how, without the physical artifact of a printed news source, how it's constantly in flux, and stories change, and things kind of, move at closer to this speed than they would have before, which was closer to like print media or publication of books or literature per se, So all this is kind of the realm of young people. And they have to kind of contend with all that. And as youth workers, how do we help them with that? So I know that that's kind of, it can look a bit like a dreadful scenario when we look at that, but there is a lot of hope there, because as we see there's a certain sort of formula, there's a certain structure that a lot of things fit into. There's a certain set of grammars. There's a lot of social norms which are just kind of upheld as that. There's a lot of sort of forms of identity, or different sort of politics of identity, or representation, or modes of representation. Like, there's all these other elements that we have to kind of look at now, where we're already under the bonnet. So that's a bit sort of interesting in terms of seeing the relationship between things. There's just one last thing to that end, and pick up on this point about swimming in the water and, not being able to discover when you're a fish, that I just wanted to kind of talk about. When it comes to the ubiquity of sound, a more abstract version, which is just kind of, broadcasting in the air per se. And I just want to kind of show one last clip around that, and then I'll come back to kind of finish off, really.
This is Nate Harrison, recording in winter of 2004. I'd like to talk about drums, or rather about a particular drum beat. I'm sure you've heard it dozens of times before. It's a ubiquitous piece of the pop culture soundscape. It's been used as a rhythmic backdrop in everything from late 80s gangster rap to corporate America's recycling hip-hop forms to sell things like Jeeps and blue jeans to suburban America. In fact, just last week, I saw a TV commercial for a pharmaceutical company where this drum beat was used to promote some sort of purple pill. It's been used so much, I might argue it's now entered into the collective audio unconscious, and did so about 3 or 4 years ago. It's been somewhat glossed over now, but it has quite a history to it. This particular drum beat, or rather this break beat, as it is more accurately called, or even more simply just break, well, this particular break is called the Amen break. Here's what it sounds like. Here, I'll play it again. This break, despite its popularity and use over the last decade or so in contemporary culture, dates back almost 40 years. The Amen break is a small piece of, and gets its name from, a song released in 1969 titled Amen Brother. Amen Brother was recorded by a funk and soul band who called themselves the Winstons. Amen Brother is the B-side of a single released by the Winstons titled Color Him Father. Color Him Father went on to win a Grammy Award for the band, becoming one of the top 100 hits of 1969. It's probably the track for which the band is best known. However, it's the B-side, Amen Brother, that has that classic drum breakdown right in the middle of the song, which makes it perfect for sampling. Here it is again, with more of the rest of the track included to give it context. So, Amen Brother was recorded, it was released, it was played, it came and went. Nothing terribly remarkable about it. However, the drum loop in the middle of the song was resuscitated with the advent of the sampler in the 1980s. Just a brief aside about the sampler, this was a machine about the size of a VCR that allowed its user to record any sound into it for quick playback and arrangement. The sampler, as well as the turntable, were principal tools largely responsible for the birth and development of hip-hop. With a sampler, any drum beat, any guitar riff, any sound that could be recorded, could be used as part of a new composition, a new contextualization. Nowadays, almost all commercially produced music has been at least in part realized with a sampler. But hip-hop and other electronic-based music genres pioneered the creative use of samplers, and the Amen break was one of the first drum samples to be experimented with. Here's an early example, the track Words of Wisdom by New York duo Third Base, released in 1989.
Smack him on the back, sit him down, say, give me some rhythm. Rip, baby, listen up my collar. Lay out like a funeral parlor. Ready, willing, filling, killing for a billion. Top, I never stop with searches and drilling it. So in the hole, MC's working, kicking it, thinking, the suckers will be jerking.
And here's another example, NWA's track Straight Outta Compton, also from 1989.
Straight out of Compton, crazy motherfucker named Ice Cube. From the gang called niggas with attitudes. When I'm called off, I got a sawed off. Squeeze the trigger and bodies all hauled off. You too, boy, if you fuck with me. The police are gonna have to come and get me.
Finally, here is Mantronics with King of the Beats from 1990. In these cases, a one-bar loop of the Amen was used to create the rhythms. That is to say, it's a fairly straightforward use of the break. As time went on and samplers became more complex, so did their usage. In the UK, right around the time Straight Outta Compton is released, the rave scene there explodes, with musicians and DJs who used samplers in the Amen break to produce hardcore techno, raga jungle, and drum and bass. Jungle in particular, it being an amalgamation of reggae toasting, heavy bass lines, and high-speed breakbeats, centers its aesthetic almost entirely around the deconstruction of the Amen. This was done by slicing the original 6-second sample into its individual drum hits. Each snare drum, each bass drum, the hi-hats, the crash cymbal. The slices could then be rearranged and manipulated in any number of ways to create new patterns. Here's an earlier jungle artist. This is Shy FX's track, Original Nata, from 1994.
I know you get back you in the jungle. Who help me? I did not have original
Okay, so yeah, just to kind of, I thought that was well worth showing in terms of pointing to the ubiquity of sound or something as abstract as sound, which is kind of hard to make to present as a tangible element in a lecture like this. But I think this does a pretty good job of doing that, and picks up in the this sort of assimilation or the ubiquity, just kind of having this particular drum loop assimilating into a collective audio unconscious, I find kind of an interesting way of looking at that, you know. But, you know, as much as all this stuff helping us being like tools and aids to look under the bonnet, I suppose it's kind of, it does all point to a certain sort of social fabrics or cultural fabrics that do and continually emerge, some related to youth culture, some related to like sort of alternative culture, music-wise, you know, even different sorts of disciplines, tribal sort of allegiances or forms of, you know, of different modes of representation and how you identify with that, I suppose. And we leave it as broadly as that, not just with like youth culture in particular and like the media behind it, but like we will look at this in relation to like much more broader or substantial sort of areas, be it race and its concepts around feminism or whatever going forward. So we will get at all that as well. But I just wanted to present this here just to kind of give it a different take on that. And you've all the skills from the last practical in the previous module of audio editing that you can go off and use the Amen break to make your own tracks whenever you want as well. So on that note, we'll leave that. And the next lecture will be on the historical context of digital multimedia communication in youth culture. The titles are a lot longer in this module. But any questions in between, please feel free to send me an email or anything whatsoever you'd like to discuss around this, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, see you in the next lecture. Thanks, bye.